In this tracing, we're going to see the interest of the specificities of the counters in St. Jude Medical Abbott devices that have been specifically designed to decrease the risk of not treating a real ventricular fibrillation in case of ventricular undersensing. So this is a case of induction at the end of the implantation of a dual chamber ICD. 2 seconds delivery of direct current followed by 600 milliseconds of blanking where sensing is not possible. You can see the induction of a real ventricular arrhythmia, polymorphic, very rapid cycles. The 2 first cycles are unbinned, since there is a discordance between the current interval and the mean value of the 4 previous intervals. Then this first cycle is classified in the VF zone because now there is a concordance between the current and the average intervals. During this episode of ventricular fibrillation, you can see some F markers and some cycles that are unbinned because there is a discordance between the current interval, which is slow, and the average value, which is fast. These cycles are not classified because of ventricular undersensing related to the low amplitude of the signals and to the beat-to-beat important variation in amplitude of the signals. Despite this problem of undersensing, the diagnosis of VF is just slightly delayed. Here, the VF counter is filled, triggering the recording of the EGM in the memory of the device and triggering the charge of the capacitors. During the charge of the capacitors, you can recognize some ventricular undersensing. At the end of the charge, the shock is delivered on the second fast cycle. Then there is a 1 second blanking without possibility of sensing, and then an additional second without possibility of pacing. The shock has been efficient, and there is a diagnosis of return to sinus after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 consecutive VP or VS cycles. In a patient implanted with an ICD, one of the major fears is not to treat a ventricular fibrillation because of a problem of ventricular undersensing, and this tracing demonstrates the major interest of the comparison between the current interval and the average value. It is very important that during an episode of VF that could threaten the life of a patient, to avoid a false diagnosis of return to sinus. In Abbott devices, for return to sinus, it is required that there are at least 3, 5, or 7 consecutive VS or VP cycles. The idea to bin the cycles with a permanent comparison between the current interval and the average value has been specifically designed to avoid the problem in case of undersensing during an episode of ventricular fibrillation. In this example, you can see that there's quite important undersensing, but despite this, there is not one single cycle that is classified VS or VP. You can see in this example that this quite important undersensing just slightly delayed the diagnosis of VF, and you can also imagine the amount of undersensing that is required to obtain the first VS cycle and then the occurrence of 3, 5, or 7 consecutive VS or VP cycles that could lead to a false diagnosis of return to sinus. Protecting the patient against a false diagnosis of return to sinus during a life-threatening episode of VF is the main interest of this comparison between the current and the average intervals.